There was a time when protecting family members, especially those who are vulnerable, was considered one of the most sacred duties a person could have. But what happened on Family Feud in March 2024 showed that sometimes the people who should protect us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. When Brian Mitchell stood on that stage and made a cruel joke about his disabled brother, he thought he was being funny. He thought the audience would laugh. He thought it would make good television. Instead, Steve Harvey did something that had never been done before in the show's history. He stopped the entire production and delivered a message about dignity and respect that would be remembered for years to come. Before we share this powerful story about standing up for those who cannot always stand up for themselves, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. These are the stories that remind us what truly matters in life. The Mitchell family from Sacramento, California, appeared to be the perfect candidates for Family Feud. They were energetic, enthusiastic, and ready to compete. The family consisted of parents William and Catherine Mitchell, both in their early 60s, and their 4 adult children. William had worked as a postal worker for 35 years before retiring, and Catherine had been a school cafeteria manager. They had raised their children with modest means but strong values, or so everyone believed. The eldest son was Brian Mitchell, age 38, a sales manager at a car dealership. Brian had always been the golden child in the family, the one who excelled at sports in high school, who was popular and confident, who seemed to move through life with ease. He had a quick wit and a sharp tongue, traits that served him well in sales where he could read people and tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. But that same sharp tongue had a darker side, one that his family had learned to tolerate over the years, even when they should not have. The second child was Amanda, age 35, a high school teacher who had inherited her mother's patience and kindness. She was married with 2 young children and had always been the peacemaker in the family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and tried to keep everyone happy. The third child was David, age 32, and his story was different from his siblings. David had been born with cerebral palsy, a condition that affected his muscle control and coordination. He used a wheelchair for mobility and had speech difficulties that made communication challenging, though certainly not impossible for those who took the time to listen and understand. David had faced more obstacles in his life than his siblings could imagine, but he had persevered with remarkable courage and determination. He had earned a college degree in computer programming and worked remotely for a tech company, a job he loved and excelled at despite the physical challenges he faced every day. The youngest was Rebecca, age 28, a nurse who had chosen her profession in part because of growing up with David and seeing the difference that compassionate care could make. She was protective of her brother and had always been his fiercest defender. David's presence in the family had shaped each of them in different ways. For the parents, he had been a source of both worry and pride, teaching them about resilience and unconditional love. For Amanda and Rebecca, he had been an inspiration, showing them what true strength looked like. But for Brian, David's disability had always been something else, something uncomfortable, something that embarrassed him, something he made jokes about to deflect his own discomfort, even when those jokes hurt his brother deeply. The family dynamics had been strained for years around this issue. Brian would make comments about David's speech, about his wheelchair, about his limitations. He would frame these comments as jokes, as brotherly teasing, as just having fun. When David or his sisters objected, Brian would accuse them of being too sensitive, of not being able to take a joke. Their parents, conflict-averse and tired from years of managing family tensions, would often tell David to let it go, to not make a big deal out of it, to understand that Brian did not mean any harm. But David knew differently. He understood that Brian's jokes were not harmless. They were expressions of embarrassment and shame. Brian had spent his whole life trying to be perfect, to be admired, to be the star of every situation. Having a disabled brother did not fit into that image, and rather than dealing with his own complicated feelings about it, Brian had chosen mockery as his defense mechanism. The invitation to appear on Family Feud had come through a friend who worked in television production. The family had been excited about the opportunity, seeing it as a chance to win some money and have a memorable experience together. David had been hesitant at first, worried about the physical logistics of being on the set and concerned about being in front of cameras. But Rebecca had encouraged him, assuring him that it would be a fun family memory and that the show's staff would accommodate his needs. What none of them had anticipated was that Brian would see the national television platform as an opportunity to make himself the center of attention in the worst possible way. As they prepared to tape the episode that March afternoon, Brian was in high spirits, joking with the production staff, practicing his game show Contestant energy. David sat in his wheelchair nearby, quieter than the others but ready to participate as best he could. He had been looking forward to this, hoping it would be one of those rare family experiences where he was included fully and treated with the same respect as everyone else. He had no idea what was about to happen. The game began with Steve Harvey's warm welcome to both families. The Mitchell family stood on one side of the stage, David positioned in his wheelchair at the end of the family line, right next to Brian. The competing family, the Johnsons from Florida, stood on the other side, and the atmosphere was filled with the usual excitement and nervous energy of a Family Feud taping. Steve went down the line introducing each family member, asking them brief questions about themselves and their lives. When he reached David, Steve took extra care to position himself so they could communicate easily. David, using his speech assistance device when needed and speaking slowly but clearly, told Steve about his work in computer programming. Steve responded with genuine interest and respect, treating David exactly as he had treated every other contestant. "That is fantastic, David," Steve said warmly. "Computer programming, that is impressive work. We are glad to have you here, man." Steve's natural kindness and ease with David set a tone of respect and inclusion that should have carried through the entire game. The first round began with the standard face-off format. Brian and a member of the Johnson family approached the podium. Steve asked the question, "Name something people do to prepare for an important interview." Brian buzzed in first and answered, "Practice answers to common questions." It was on the board as the number 2 answer. The Johnson family member then answered, "Research the company," which was the number 1 answer. The Johnsons won the face-off and chose to play. The round proceeded with the Johnson family giving answers, some on the board and some not. They eventually struck out, giving the Mitchell family a chance to steal. Steve asked the question again, "Name something people do to prepare for an important interview." The Mitchell family huddled together to discuss their strategy. Amanda suggested pick out an outfit, which seemed like a strong answer. Rebecca agreed. Their parents nodded. Brian, however, had a different idea, and he saw an opportunity to make what he thought would be a memorable television moment. When they broke from the huddle, Steve asked for their answer. Brian, as the most vocal member of the family, stepped forward as their spokesperson. But before giving the actual answer, he turned to the camera with a big smile and said, "Well, Steve, we talked about a lot of options, but we did not ask David because, he has never had to worry about job interviews. They just give those jobs to people like him to meet quotas." The words hung in the air for a moment. There was a smattering of uncomfortable laughter from a few audience members who were not sure if this was acceptable humor or not. David's face showed hurt and humiliation. Rebecca looked shocked and angry. Amanda's mouth dropped open in disbelief. Their parents looked uncomfortable but said nothing, falling into their familiar pattern of avoiding confrontation with Brian. Steve Harvey's expression changed instantly. The warm smile disappeared, replaced by a look of serious concern. But before he could respond, Brian continued, apparently thinking his joke had landed well and that he should keep going. I am kidding," Brian said, though his tone suggested he was not really kidding at all. "But seriously, David is great with computers because he has so much time just sitting around." He gestured toward David's wheelchair as he said this, and a few more uncomfortable laughs came from the audience. David's eyes filled with tears that he tried desperately to hold back. His sisters moved closer to him, protective and furious. And Steve Harvey made a decision in that moment that would become one of the defining moments of his career. Steve raised his hand, signaling to the production booth. "Stop! Stop everything! Cut the cameras!" He spoke with an authority that made it clear this was not a request. The studio fell silent. The audience sensed that something serious was happening. The production team, confused but responsive to Steve's command, stopped the taping. Steve walked slowly from center stage directly toward Brian Mitchell. Every step was deliberate. When he reached Brian, he looked him directly in the eyes with an expression that held no humor, no warmth, no entertainment value. This was something else entirely. "What did you just say?" Steve asked, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the now silent studio. Brian, suddenly realizing he had miscalculated badly, tried to backtrack. "I was just joking, Steve. It was just a joke. David knows I am just messing around." Steve shook his head slowly. "No. That was not a joke. Let me tell you what a joke is. A joke is something that makes people laugh because it is clever or surprising or reveals truth in a funny way. What you just did was mock your brother for having a disability. That is not a joke. That is cruelty disguised as humor." Brian tried to protest. "Come on, Steve. We joke around like this all the time in our family." Steve turned to look at David, whose face showed clearly that this was not okay, that these jokes were not harmless, that years of this treatment had taken a toll. Steve then looked at Rebecca and Amanda, whose expressions confirmed what David's face had already revealed. He turned back to Brian. "Does your brother look like he thinks it is funny?" Steve asked pointedly. Brian glanced at David and then looked away, unable or unwilling to face the pain he had caused. "He is just sensitive," Brian muttered. And that was when Steve Harvey delivered a message that would resonate far beyond that studio. Steve Harvey positioned himself so that he was addressing not just Brian, but the entire studio audience, the production crew, and by extension, everyone who would eventually watch this moment. His voice was firm and carried the weight of moral authority. "Let me tell you something about sensitivity," Steve began. "When people say someone is too sensitive about being mocked for their disability, for their race, for their appearance, for anything they cannot control, what they are really saying is, I want to be able to hurt you without consequences. I want to be cruel without accountability. That is not acceptable, not here, not anywhere, but especially not from a brother to a brother." He turned directly to Brian again. "Your brother was born with cerebral palsy. He did not choose that. He has spent his entire life working harder than you can imagine just to do things that you take for granted. Getting dressed in the morning, getting to work, communicating with people who do not take the time to listen to him properly. Every single day is harder for him than it is for you. And instead of respecting that, instead of celebrating his incredible achievements despite those challenges, you mock him. You make him the punchline of your jokes. You do this to make yourself feel superior, to get attention, to avoid dealing with your own discomfort about having a disabled brother." Brian's face had gone from defensive to pale. He had not expected this level of confrontation, had not anticipated that his behavior would be called out so directly and so publicly. Steve continued, his voice growing more passionate. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at David. I see a man who earned a college degree despite physical challenges that would have defeated most people. I see a man who works in computer programming, a demanding field that requires intelligence and skill. I see a man who shows up in this world every day with courage and dignity despite having to deal with people who underestimate him, who pity him, or worse, who mock him. That is what I see. What do you see when you look at your brother?" Brian could not answer. Siblings, Rebecca and Amanda, were crying openly now. Their parents looked devastated, perhaps finally seeing clearly what they had allowed to happen in their family for years by not confronting Brian's behavior. Steve turned to David directly. "David, I want to apologize to you on behalf of this show. You came here to have a good experience with your family, and instead you were disrespected by the person who should be protecting you the most. That is not acceptable. You deserve better than that. You deserve a brother who is proud of you, who respects you, who understands what you have accomplished." David nodded, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak but clearly moved by having someone finally stand up for him in this way. Steve then addressed the studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to talk about something serious right now. We live in a society where people think they can say anything and then add, 'just kidding,' and it makes it okay. It does not make it okay. Words have power. They have the power to hurt, to diminish, to damage someone's spirit. When we mock people for things they cannot control, when we make jokes at the expense of people who are vulnerable, we are not being funny. We are being bullies." He turned back to Brian. "You are 38 years old. You are old enough to know better. You are old enough to understand that your words have impact. Your brother has lived his whole life hearing these kinds of comments from strangers, from people who do not know him, who cannot see past his disability to the person he is. But he should never, ever have to hear that from his own brother. Your family should be his refuge, his place of safety and acceptance. Instead, you have made your family a place where he gets hurt." Steve paused, letting his words sink in. Then he asked Brian a direct question. "Do you love your brother?" Brian, now clearly shaken and beginning to understand the gravity of what he had done, answered quietly, "Yes, yes, I love him." "Then why do you treat him this way?" Steve asked simply. Brian struggled to answer. Finally, he said something honest for perhaps the first time that day. "I do not know, I think maybe I have been embarrassed, not of him, but of, I do not know, maybe of people judging me for having a disabled brother, maybe of not knowing how to deal with it. So I made jokes instead of dealing with my own feelings." Steve nodded slowly. "That is honest, and maybe that is a start, but you need to understand something. Your discomfort about your brother's disability is your problem to solve, not his burden to carry. He has enough to deal with without having to manage your feelings about his condition. You need to do the work to figure out why you are embarrassed, why you cope through mockery, why you have prioritized your own comfort over his dignity. That is on you." Steve turned to address the parents, William and Catherine. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I need to say something to you as well. You have allowed this dynamic to continue in your family. When one child mocks another, especially when that mockery is about a disability, The parents have a responsibility to stop it immediately. By staying silent, by telling David to not be so sensitive, by avoiding confrontation, you have essentially told Brian that his behavior is acceptable. You have told David that protecting Brian's feelings is more important than protecting David's dignity. That has to change. Catherine Mitchell was crying openly now. William looked like he had been struck with a painful truth he had been avoiding for years. Steve's words were hard, but they were true, and the truth was something this family desperately needed. Steve then turned to Rebecca and Amanda. You two have been trying to protect your brother, I can see that. Keep doing that. Keep standing up for him. But also know that David is strong enough to stand up for himself when people give him the space and respect to do it. Your job is not to fight all his battles, but to support him in fighting his own battles. Finally, Steve addressed the entire Mitchell family together. You have a choice to make right now. You can dismiss what happened here today. You can go home and fall back into the same patterns. Brian can keep making cruel jokes and calling them humor. David can keep swallowing his pain and pretending it does not hurt. Your parents can keep avoiding conflict, and your family can continue to be a place where cruelty is tolerated in the name of keeping the peace. He paused, then continued. Or you can recognize this moment for what it is, a turning point, a chance to do better. Brian, you can apologize truly and deeply, not just with words, but with changed behavior. Mom and Dad, you can start holding all your children accountable for how they treat each other. And David, you can stop accepting treatment that hurts you just because it is coming from family. Family should be held to a higher standard, not a lower one. The studio remained silent, everyone present understanding they were witnessing something profound. This was not entertainment. This was a family being held up to a mirror and being forced to see themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time. Brian finally spoke, his voice shaking. Steve, you are right, you are absolutely right. I have been cruel and I have hidden behind calling it jokes. David. He turned to his brother, tears in his eyes. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for every joke, every comment, every time I made you feel less than you are. You are incredible. You have accomplished things I could never do. And instead of celebrating you, I have torn you down. I am ashamed of myself. David looked at his brother, and in his eyes was a mixture of pain, hope, and question. Would this apology lead to real change, or was it just words spoken under pressure that would fade once they left the studio? Steve seemed to sense David's doubt. Brian, actions speak louder than words. The question is not whether you feel sorry right now in this moment when you have been confronted. The question is whether you will do the hard work to change your behavior, to address whatever is inside you that led to this cruelty in the first place. That is what will determine if this apology means anything. What happened next was unprecedented in family feud history. Steve Harvey made the decision that the Mitchell family would not continue competing that day. The emotional weight of what had transpired made continuing with a game show impossible. The Johnson family was given a pass to the next round, and the Mitchell family was asked to leave the stage. But this was not the end of their story. It was, in many ways, the beginning. Steve arranged for the Mitchell family to meet with him privately after the taping. In that private conversation, away from cameras and audiences, he spoke to them more deeply about family dynamics, respect, and the work they needed to do. He recommended family therapy. He talked to Brian specifically about the need for individual counseling to address the roots of his behavior. He spoke to the parents about their role in enabling destructive patterns by avoiding conflict. And he spoke to David about his right to demand respect and to set boundaries with family members who hurt him. The family left the studio that day shaken and uncertain. The experience had been humiliating for Brian, painful for David, and eye-opening for the entire family. But it had also planted seeds that would eventually grow into real change. When the episode aired 2 months later, the producers made the difficult decision to include the incident and Steve's intervention. They understood this was not typical game show content, but they felt the message was too important to bury. They added a comprehensive introduction explaining what viewers were about to see and providing resources for families dealing with disability issues and sibling conflict. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The clip of Steve stopping the show and confronting Brian went viral within hours of airing. Disability rights organizations praised Steve for taking a stand against the mockery that disabled individuals face regularly, often from their own families. Mental health professionals noted the importance of calling out harmful family dynamics and the courage it takes to disrupt patterns that have been established for decades. David Mitchell received thousands of messages from people who understood his experience. Fellow individuals with disabilities shared their own stories of being mocked by family members, of having their pain dismissed as being too sensitive, of being told they should accept disrespectful treatment because it was just jokes. Many said that seeing Steve stand up for David had given them the courage to set boundaries with family members who had been treating them similarly. Brian Mitchell faced significant public criticism. His employer received numerous complaints, and he was required to attend sensitivity training. His social circle learned about what had happened, and many friendships were damaged or ended. The public consequences were severe, and he faced a level of accountability that he had never experienced before. But Brian did something that surprised many people. Instead of becoming defensive or disappearing from public view, he used the experience as a catalyst for genuine change. He entered therapy and began the difficult work of understanding why he had treated his brother so cruelly. He wrote a public apology that went beyond words, outlining specific steps he was taking to change his behavior and his thinking. In that apology, Brian revealed that he had spent his whole life trying to be perfect, trying to be the star, trying to prove his worth through achievement and status. Having a disabled brother had complicated that narrative in his mind. He had felt, irrationally and unfairly, that David's disability somehow reflected on him, made him less perfect by association. Rather than confronting those ugly feelings, he had tried to distance himself from David through mockery, creating a separation that made him feel superior rather than connected. Brian acknowledged that this was his problem, his failing, his shame to carry. He apologized not just for the incident on Family Feud, but for years of accumulated cruelty. He committed to doing better and to using his public mistake as an opportunity to educate others about the harm of disability mockery. The Mitchell family entered therapy together, and the work was difficult and painful. Years of dysfunctional patterns had to be examined and dismantled. The parents had to face their failure to protect David from his brother's cruelty. They had to acknowledge that their conflict avoidance had enabled Brian's behavior and had taught David that his feelings did not matter as much as family peace. David had to learn to set boundaries and to believe that he deserved respect not because he had accomplished impressive things despite his disability, but simply because he was a human being with inherent dignity. He had to unlearn the pattern of accepting whatever treatment came his way from family just because they were family. Rebecca and Amanda supported the process while also examining their own roles in the family dynamic. They realized that while they had tried to protect David, they had sometimes done so in ways that inadvertently reinforced the idea that he needed protection rather than that Brian needed to change his behavior. 6 months after the Family Feud incident, Steve Harvey invited the Mitchell family to appear on his talk show for a follow-up segment. The family looked different, carried themselves differently. There was a visible shift in the dynamics among them. Brian sat next to David rather than at a distance. Their parents looked more present and engaged rather than checked out and conflict avoidant. Rebecca and Amanda seemed more relaxed, no longer carrying the tension of constantly trying to manage family peace. During the interview, Brian spoke openly about the work he had been doing in therapy. He talked about unpacking his own ableism, his internalized shame about disability, and his need for constant validation. He spoke about how the public accountability had been painful but necessary, forcing him to face consequences that he had avoided his entire life. David spoke as well, using his communication device when needed and taking his time to express himself. He talked about how difficult it had been to carry years of hurt from his brother's mockery. He explained that the incident on Family Feud had not been the first time Brian had humiliated him, but he hoped it would be the last. He spoke about learning in therapy that he did not have to accept mistreatment from anyone, even family, and that his disability did not make him less deserving of respect and dignity. The parents, William and Catherine, spoke with humility about their failures. They acknowledged that they had prioritized superficial family harmony over David's well-being, that they had sent damaging messages to all their children about what was acceptable in relationships. They talked about learning to have difficult conversations, to hold Brian accountable, and to support David in advocating for himself. The interview was powerful and honest, showing a family that had been broken by years of dysfunction beginning the slow work of healing. Steve Harvey emphasized that this was not a story with a neat, happy ending, but rather a story about the ongoing work of doing better, of choosing to change harmful patterns even when that work is uncomfortable. The impact of the Mitchell family story continued to grow. Schools began using the Family Feud clip as a teaching tool about disability awareness and bullying prevention. The segment was included in diversity and inclusion training programs at companies across the country. Disability rights organizations referenced it in their advocacy work, using it as an example of how ableism manifests even in families and why it must be confronted directly. Brian Mitchell became an unexpected advocate for disability rights and anti-bullying initiatives. He spoke publicly about his experience, not to excuse his behavior, but to help others recognize similar patterns in themselves before they caused the harm he had caused. He worked with organizations that educated siblings of disabled individuals about supporting rather than resenting their brothers and sisters. His advocacy work was genuine and sustained, not just a public relations gesture, but a real commitment to using his mistake to help others avoid similar failures. David Mitchell also became a voice for disability rights, but from a different perspective. He spoke about the experience of living with a disability in a society that often either pities disabled individuals or treats them as inspirational simply for existing. He talked about the importance of being seen as a whole person, not defined solely by disability, but also not having disability ignored or minimized. He advocated for people with disabilities to be given the space and respect to advocate for themselves rather than always having others speak for them. The Mitchell family story became part of a larger cultural conversation about how families handle disability, how siblings can harbor complex and sometimes ugly feelings about having a disabled brother or sister, and how those feelings must be processed healthily rather than expressed through cruelty. Family therapists reported increased requests for help with similar dynamics, with families finally addressing issues that had been buried for years. Steve Harvey reflected on the experience in subsequent interviews. He talked about the responsibility that comes with having a platform and the importance of using that platform to address real issues, even when it means stopping the entertainment to deal with something serious. He explained that he could not have continued hosting the game show as if nothing had happened after witnessing Brian mock David. To do so would have been to implicitly endorse that behavior, to suggest it was acceptable, and he refused to send that message. 3 years after the original incident, the Mitchell family returned to Family Feud for a redemption appearance. This time, the family dynamic was visibly healthier. Brian's interactions with David were respectful and supportive. When David gave answers during the game, Brian celebrated his brother's contributions rather than dismissing or mocking them. The parents engaged with all their children equally, no longer showing the favoritism and avoidance that had characterized their earlier behavior. During this appearance, David gave an answer that was not on the board, and the family struck out. In that moment, Brian put his arm around David's shoulders and said clearly for everyone to hear, "Good try, brother. I'm proud of you for putting yourself out there." It was a small moment, but for those who had seen the original episode, it represented a profound transformation. The family did not win the game that day either, but they won something more valuable. They won the respect of viewers who appreciated seeing a family that had done the hard work of change. They demonstrated that destructive patterns can be broken, that people can grow and do better, and that families can heal if they are willing to face uncomfortable truths and commit to genuine transformation. The story of what happened on Family Feud that March day remained one of the most referenced moments in the show's history. It stood as a powerful example of how cruelty toward disabled individuals is often disguised as humor, how family members can be the worst perpetrators of this cruelty, and how important it is for bystanders to intervene when they witness such behavior. The episode became required viewing in social work programs, special education courses, and disability studies classes. It was analyzed in academic papers about family dynamics and ableism. It was discussed in support groups for families of disabled individuals, and it was remembered by countless people as the moment when someone finally said what needed to be said. That mockery of disabled individuals is not humor, that family relationships require respect regardless of ability, and that silence in the face of cruelty is complicity. For David Mitchell, the experience had been initially traumatic but ultimately transformative. He had been humiliated on national television, but he had also been defended powerfully and publicly. He had been forced to confront years of accumulated pain, but he had also been given validation that his pain was real and his dignity mattered. He had been shown by Steve Harvey's intervention that he deserved better treatment, and that lesson had changed how he approached all his relationships moving forward. For Brian Mitchell, the experience had been the wake-up call he needed but had never received. The public accountability had been harsh, but it had broken through the defenses and justifications that had allowed him to continue his cruel behavior for decades. The work he had done since that day was ongoing and would likely continue for the rest of his life. But it was necessary work that made him a better person, a better brother, and a better example for others who struggled with similar issues. For the Mitchell family as a whole, the family feud incident had exposed dysfunction that had been festering beneath the surface for years. The exposure had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Without that moment of public accountability, they likely would have continued in their destructive patterns indefinitely, causing more pain and damage to relationships that should have been sources of support and love.